At 71, Eleanor Hargrove had $43, a duffel bag, and a graying old dog named Biscuit, who didn't understand why the only home they'd known now belonged to somebody else. The home was a brick fourplex on Sevier Avenue in South Knoxville, and the man who took it never once climbed its stairs. So she went looking for the only thing still in her name. A rusted houseboat called the Marigold, sitting at a slip at Concord Marina off North Shore Drive, that nobody in this town had wanted in 30 years. She came down to the river for a dry place to sleep. She did not know, not yet, that below its waterline, behind a hatch her grandfather had sealed for the last time, lay something written in his own hand that would stop a developer's bulldozers cold. The eviction notice was still folded in her cardigan pocket. The good mustard one, dated the 4th of March. That was where the whole thing started. For 31 years, she had climbed the same 14 stairs to the upstairs unit, the ones that creaked on the 7th step and the 11th, the ones she could have walked blind and most mornings nearly did. She had lived there alone the better part of those years, the last of the Hargroves, a woman who had fed other people's children for 26 years on the lunch line at Sequoia Elementary, ladling green beans and saying their names back to them until her knees gave out and the county handed her a small pension and a thinner thank you. It was not much of a life to look at from the outside. From the inside, it had been enough. It had been hers. The building changed hands the autumn before. One Tuesday, the rent envelope she mailed came back unopened, and a new address took its place. Crisp letterhead, Callaway Development Group. A little river view stamped right into the logo. The rent stayed $640 a month, which should have told her something. A man like Brett Callaway did not buy a tired fourplex on Sevier Avenue for the rent. He bought it for the dirt under it and the water past the dirt. The notice came certified, so she had to sign for her own bad news. 90 days. Her building and 3 beside it were coming down come spring for something the letter called a riverfront revitalization, which is the kind of phrase that sounds like progress right up until you are the thing being revitalized out of the picture. She put on the mustard cardigan and rode the bus downtown to ask for time. 60 extra days, she had decided. That was a number a reasonable man could live with.
Thank you. We'll review these.
The Callaway office sat on the 8th floor, all glass and gray carpet and the smell of new paint over cold coffee. A young woman at the front desk asked if she had an appointment in the tone people use when they already know the answer. "I won't take but a minute of his time," Eleanor said. She waited 40 of them on a hard couch with her hands folded over the notice in her lap. When Brett Callaway finally came through, he was buttoning his jacket on his way to somewhere better. Maybe 40 years old, good haircut, the easy smile of a man who had never once signed for his own bad news. "Ms. Hargrove," he said, reading it off the page his assistant handed him. "Sevier Avenue." "Right. 31 years I've been in that apartment," she said. "I'm asking for 60 days past the 90. That's all I'm asking." The notice was the courtesy, Ms. Hargrove. 90 days is already more than the law makes me give. He said it kindly, in the way that costs a man nothing. Crews start in the spring. I can't move a whole permit for one tenant. You understand. I'm 71 years old, and we'd be glad to get you a list of available units. He was already turning. "Talk to Reese on your way out. She'll have the relocation sheet." He called it relocation, the way other men call it weather, like no hand had ever made it happen. Then he was gone down the hall, and the glass door sighed shut behind him, and that was the whole of it. The relocation sheet listed apartments that cost half again what she paid, on bus lines that ran nowhere she knew. She folded it once and never looked at it again. Moving day came the way the worst days do, ordinary, gray, and right on time. By the morning of the 4th of June, she had sold what wouldn't fit in a borrowed trunk and given the rest away to anyone who'd carry it down. Her whole life came down to a duffel bag, 2 hard suitcases, a smaller train case that had been her mother's, and $43 in a church envelope she had counted twice that morning. The way you go back and check a stove you already know is off. The new lock went on at noon, She stood on the sidewalk on Sevier Avenue with Biscuit's leash in one hand and watched a man she had never met work a fresh brass key into her own front door and test it, twice to be sure. He was polite about it. He even held the gate for her on his way out. Behind her, 31 years. In front of her, the river, and one rusted thing still wearing her family's name. The marigold had become hers 4 years back, when her grandfather, Walt Hargrove, finally let go of his grip on this world at the age of 91. Walt had lived aboard that boat the last 20 years of his life, a stubborn old riverman who trusted a bank about as far as he could throw one. When he passed, the lawyer handling the little estate had been almost apologetic. The houseboat, he explained, was worth maybe $2,000 against all that rust, and the back fees on the slip ran close behind. More liability than asset, he had said, the way men in offices describe anything that won't earn them money. She had signed the paper that made the marigold hers, put it in a drawer, and never once driven out to look at the thing. A boat was the last item a woman in a fourth-floor walk-up needed. Now it was a roof, the only one left. A neighbor from the old building, a younger woman named Carla Webb, drove her out in a hatchback that smelled of cigarettes and pine air freshener, the bags piled high in the back and Biscuit panting between them. Concord Marina sat at the end of a gravel turn off North Shore Drive, where Fort Loudoun Lake widens and the Tennessee River goes slow and brown and patient. Once it had been a going concern. Now half the slips sat empty and the other half held houseboats that hadn't moved under their own power in a decade. Hulls streaked with rust and bird mess, windows gone milky as cataracts. Across the water, 2 condo cranes stood against the sky like patient herons, a little closer every spring. Anybody with eyes could see which way the wind blew out here. The new money was coming for the water, and the old boats were in the way. Carla helped her stack the bags at the head of the dock, hugged her too quickly, and drove off before the dust had even settled. And then it was just Eleanor Hargrove, 71 years old in a mustard cardigan, with a duffel bag, 3 suitcases, a tired dog, and no earthly idea which of these rotting boats was hers. A few men were working on a pontoon boat 2 slips down. They stopped to watch her, the way men sometimes do, with their hands resting on their tools. She hauled the first suitcase onto the dock. The wheels, made for airport tile, caught in every gap and seam between the boards and quit rolling altogether, so she carried it instead, listing hard to one side, switching hands every 20 feet. "You lost, ma'am?" one of them called. Not unkindly, but the younger one beside him laughed before she could even answer. "I'm looking for the marigold," she said. That brought a different kind of quiet. Then the laugh came back. "That old tub?" the young one said. "Lady, ain't nobody lived on the marigold since before you went gray. She don't float so much as she just sits there being stubborn about it." "She's mine," Eleanor said. The words came out steadier than she felt. "Then I'm real sorry for you," he said, and turned back to his work. And the men laughed the small, mean laugh of people relieved the trouble belonged to somebody else. She kept walking. She had been laughed at before by better men than these, and she had learned a long time ago that you do not give the laugh anywhere to land. You just keep your eyes on the next board and you walk. The marigold sat at the last slip, the one farthest out, where the dock pinched down to a single plank and the river opened up wide and gray beyond it. By the time she reached it, the sun had dropped behind the far ridge and the light had gone the color of weak tea. She set the train case down with the others and stood there a moment, a duffel bag, 3 suitcases, and 1 old dog at her feet. Biscuit pressed himself against her ankle and looked up at her, then up at the boat, the way he did when he needed to know whether a thing was safe. Eleanor picked the smallest case back up again, just to have something to hold on to, and looked up at the hull of the marigold, the houseboat nobody had wanted in 30 years. It was bigger than she had pictured. 2 stories of it, a steel hull gone the dull orange of old blood, a wheelhouse perched up top with most of its glass, somehow still whole. and faded white letters across the stern spelled out Marigold, a name no one in her family had ever bothered to explain to her, a name she had always taken to be just a name, the way boats have them. The gangplank was a single gray board with a rope for a rail. She tested it with her foot. It held her. Inside, the air was cold and close, and it smelled of river mud and old diesel and something underneath both of those, something like cedar and dry paper that she couldn't place. The galley was small and tidy in the way of a man who lived alone and knew where everything was. A narrow bunk, quilts folded square at the foot of it, a drop-leaf table, a row of drawers along the galley wall, each one swollen shut with damp. She would learn this boat by touch in the days to come. For now, she only stood in the middle of it and let her breathing slow. She found the ladder to the wheelhouse and climbed it slow, her knees announcing every rung. Up top, the last gray light came in through the old glass, and the river lay flat and endless out the forward windows, going dark at the edges. She put her hand on the wheel, worn smooth by a man's grip over years she hadn't been there for, and then she looked up and saw it. Cut into the oak beam over the wheel, deep and careful, the way a man carves a thing he means to outlast him, were 6 words in her grandfather's hand. The river keeps what the bank can't. She read it twice. She ran her thumb along the grooves of the letters and felt the cold of 40 years living in them. Walt had carved that. Walt, who trusted no bank, who had lived out here alone on the water with whatever it was he kept. Below her, the boat creaked and settled in the dark, riding low in the stern, heavier back there than an empty old boat had any right to be. Down on the deck, Biscuit had begun to sniff at the floorboards near the stern, low and certain. She told him to hush and come up out of the cold. He didn't. He just kept working that one board near the back of the boat, scratching now, like he'd found the very start of something. She told him to hush a second time, and a second time he paid her no mind. Biscuit was a good dog and an old one, well past listening to anything he didn't happen to agree with, and whatever lived under that board near the stern had the whole of his attention now. His nails worked the seam between 2 planks, a small dry scratching that was the only sound on the entire dark marina, besides the slow slap of water against the hull. Eleanor came down the ladder from the wheelhouse the careful way, one rung at a time, both hands holding on, and crossed the cabin to him, and lowered herself down with a hand on the bunk frame, and laid her palm flat on the floor where he was digging. The wood was cold. That was all. Just a board like the boards on either side of it, gone soft and gray with 40 years of river damp. She pressed on it, and it gave the smallest bit, the way tired wood does, and she told herself that was the whole of the matter, an old boat full of old give. "There's nothing down there but bilge water and spiders," she said to the dog, "and I'd thank you to leave the both of them right where they are." But she didn't altogether believe it, and Biscuit plainly didn't either. He sat back on his haunches and looked at her with those clouded brown eyes, then looked back at the board and gave one low sound in his chest that wasn't quite a whine. She knew that sound. He'd made it at the old apartment the morning the men came with the lock, standing at the top of the 14 stairs, telling her in the only language he had that something was about to change and she had best pay attention. She had not paid attention then. She had not known how. "All right," she said. "All right, old man, we'll look in the morning. I can't lift a floorboard in the dark on my first night, and neither can you." That seemed to settle him, or else he was simply too tired to argue further, which is its own kind of settling. He turned 3 slow circles on the cold floor the way he'd done his whole life and lay down with a grunt right on top of the board he'd been worrying, as if to keep it from getting away in the night. The first night aboard the Marigold was the longest Eleanor had spent awake in years. She made the narrow bunk up with the quilts she found folded square at the foot of it, and the moment she shook the first one out, the smell of him came up out of the cloth and stopped her cold. Pipe tobacco, long gone stale, cedar, river, Walt. She had not stood close to her grandfather in the last decade of his life. Not really, the visits having thinned to a Christmas card and a phone call that always ran out of things to say before it ran out of minutes. And here he was, all at once, in a quilt. More him than the few photographs she owned. She sat down on the edge of the bunk and held the quilt to her face for a while in the dark and let the river rock her. And if her shoulders shook some, there was no one but the dog to see it, and the dog had the good manners to look away. She slept finally near dawn in her clothes, under 3 of his quilts, with the mustard cardigan still on and Biscuit's weight against her feet, and the boat creaked and ticked and settled around her all night like a thing breathing in its sleep. She woke to gray light and the certain knowledge that her socks were wet, not soaked, damp, but damp in the way that meant water had come up to find her in the night, and a woman doesn't reach 71 without learning that water coming up uninvited is never good news. She swung her feet down and they met a cold, shallow skim of it, maybe an inch, sliding back and forth across the cabin floor with the small motion of the river, catching the gray light, like something alive. The Marigold was taking on water, slow but taking it on, the way she'd been doing quietly for years with no one aboard to notice or care. Eleanor Hargrove had fed school children green beans for 26 years and buried most everyone she'd ever loved and signed for her own eviction with a steady hand. And she was not about to be run off a boat by an inch of river. She rolled her slacks to the knee, found a dented bucket under the galley sink, and she got down on her knees on that wet floor and went looking for where the water was getting in. She found the bilge by feel, a low, dark space beneath a hatchboard near the center of the cabin, and she found it most of the way full, and she found the old hand pump beside it, seized with rust into a single useless lump. So she bailed it by hand, bucket by bucket, up the ladder and over the rail and into the river it had come from, and back down again, her knees singing, her back a slow fire, her breath fogging in the cold cabin air. It took her the better part of 2 hours, and the water came back a little, even as she worked, but she got ahead of it. By the time the sun cleared the far ridge and laid a long gold stripe down the Tennessee River, the Marigold rode an inch higher, and Eleanor sat on the wet floor with her back against the bunk and her arms gone to rubber, and she laughed, one short surprise sound because she had done it. Whatever else came, she had kept the boat up one more day. That's the rent, she told Biscuit, who had supervised the entire operation from the dry top of his floorboard. That's what it costs to sleep here. You and me, we bail. It was Dot Pruitt who found her like that, soaked to the knee and laughing at her dog on the floor of a sinking boat.
She's mine.
Well, came a voice from the dock, dry as a corn husk. You're either the new owner or you're the strangest thief I ever saw, on account of there's not one thing on that boat worth stealing. Eleanor came up the ladder, blinking into the morning. On the dock stood a woman somewhere north of 80, built low and square and weathered to the color and texture of a creek stone, in a man's flannel shirt and rubber boots, with a thermos under one arm and a face that had clearly spent its whole life out of doors and saw no reason to apologize for it. 2 paper cups were stacked in her free hand. Eleanor Hargrove, Eleanor said. I own her, the Marigold. I'm afraid I own her. Something moved across the old woman's face at the name, quick, there and gone like a fish turning under brown water. Hargrove, she said. Course you are. You've got Walt Stubborn right across the eyes. She came down the finger of Doc to the Marigold slip without being asked, sure on the boards in a way that took Eleanor 40 feet to manage, and she held out a paper cup. Dot Pruitt. I ran this marina 36 years before my knees retired me to a lawn chair. Knew your granddaddy near 40 of them. Coffee's bad and it's hot, which is the only 2 things coffee owes anybody. Eleanor took the cup with both wet hands, and the heat of it went straight through her like a kindness, which is what it was. You knew Walt. Everybody out here knew Walt, and Walt knew the river better than the river knew itself. Dot eased herself down onto an overturned crate on the dock with the grunt of a body that had earned every ache it carried. and looked up at the rusted hull above them with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read, fond and sorrowful both at once. 20 years he lived on this tub, watched everybody else's houseboat go to the bank or the breakers, and just kept on bailing his own, same as you're doing right now by the look of your trousers. Stubbornest man God ever floated. She takes on water, Eleanor said. I bailed her 2 hours this morning. She'll do that. Walt had her tight as a drum, but tight don't last with nobody aboard to tend it. 4 years she sat empty after he passed. Dot blew across her coffee. Lawyers wanted to haul her off, said she was a liability. I told them she was paid for and stubborn, and they could leave her be, and I reckon they had bigger fish. So they did. She squinted up at Eleanor. Didn't expect to ever see a Hargrove come back down to her, I'll tell you that. Thought you all had forgotten she was out here. I had, Eleanor said, and there was no use dressing it up. I'd never once come to see her. I had her 4 years and never drove out. I thought a boat was the last thing a woman in an apartment needed. She looked down at the cup in her hands, and then I didn't have the apartment. Dot Pruitt was quiet a moment. The water moved. A heron stood one-legged on a far piling like it was being paid to. Calloway, she said, not a question. The name came out of her flat and hard, like she was setting a stone down on the dock between them. Eleanor looked up sharp. How would you know that? Because I've got eyes, and because that man's name is on a sign across the water that gets bigger every spring. Dot tipped her head toward the far shore, where the 2 condo cranes stood against the morning. And now that Eleanor followed the gesture, she could see it. A billboard down the bank. White and blue and clean, too far to read but not too far to understand. Calloway Development, riverfront living. They've been buying up this whole bend of the river a parcel at a time. Bought the marshland south of here. Bought the old fish camp. Folks figured it was only a matter of time before they came for the marina too, and the slips with it. She fixed Eleanor with a look. And now here's Walt's girl. Ran off her own porch by the very same outfit, come to roost on the one piece of this river they don't own. That's not luck, honey. That's just how the water runs. Downhill, and to the lowest spot, and right to the foot of whoever's already standing in the cold. Eleanor sat down slow on the rail of her own boat. She had not, in all the grief and the bailing, put the 2 things side by side. The man on the 8th floor buttoning his jacket, the cranes across the water, the same name. Calloway had taken the brick fourplex on Sevier Avenue out from under her, and Calloway was reaching for the river too, and she had run from the one straight into the shadow of the other, the way a rabbit runs from the dog into the road. He's gonna want this slip, she said quietly. He's gonna want this whole marina, and the mud under it, and the air over it if he can find a way to bill you for breathing. Dot took a long pull of her bad coffee. Question is what Walt wanted, and Walt never did a thing in his life by accident, including dying broke. She set the cup on her knee. You know what he used to say, your granddaddy? Said it so often the boys out here used to mouth it behind his back. Said the river keeps what the bank can't. Eleanor went very still. The coffee stopped halfway to her mouth. I saw that, she said, last night, up in the wheelhouse. He carved it into the beam over the wheel. She looked at the old woman on the crate. What did he mean by it? And Dot Pruitt, who had known Walt Hargrove 40 years and kept, though Eleanor did not know it yet, every slip ledger and signed receipt the marina office had ever thrown in the bin, looked back up at the rusted hull of the Marigold and was quiet for a long moment, the way a person goes quiet when they are deciding how much of a thing to say out loud. I always figured, she said slowly, it was just an old riverman talking, a man who didn't trust banks running his mouth about it. She frowned at the boat. But I'll tell you what's queer. Now you've got me thinking on it. Walt didn't have 2 nickels to rub together at the end. Everybody knew that. Pension and a tin of tobacco, that was Walt. She tapped the side of her cup, and yet that man never once missed a slip fee in 20 years. Paid it cash, on the first, in an envelope, every single month, right up until the month he died. Never asked for time. Never came up short. She looked at Eleanor. Now you tell me. Where does a broke old man who don't trust a bank keep 20 years of cash money where the damp won't rot it and nobody thinks to look? Below them, in the cabin, slow and certain, Biscuit had begun once more to scratch at the board near the stern. Eleanor set her cup down on the rail. Where does a man keep 20 years of cash money, she said, turning the question over slow. The way you turn a stone to see what's gone pale on its underside. I don't know, Dot. I knew him less than you did, it seems. You knew him as a granddaddy. I knew him as a tenant who paid on the first of the month for 20 years and never once looked me in the eye when he handed it over, like the handing of it embarrassed him. Dot pushed herself up off the crate with both square hands flat on her knees and stood there a moment, listening. The scratching came up out of the open hatch, dry and patient, the small sound of an old dog who has decided. But that animal of yours seems to have formed an opinion on the matter. Eleanor looked down through the hatch at Biscuit, who had quit his digging just long enough to look back up at her with those clouded eyes, and then went right back to it. He's been at that one board since the minute we came aboard, she said. I told him it was bilge and spiders. Walt told me the same thing for 20 years, near about, anytime anybody got curious about the back end of this boat, bilge and spiders and don't mind the smell. Dot's mouth tightened in a way that wasn't quite a smile. I never once believed him. I just liked him too much to push it. The two of them went down into the cabin then, Eleanor first and easy, Dot after her, slow and grunting, lowering herself rung by rung with her tongue between her teeth, and a few words about her knees that a church-going woman ought not to use. By the time she got both rubber boots onto the wet floor, she was breathing like a bellows. But she got there, and she stood in the gray light of the cabin and looked around her at the bunk and the galley and the little iron stove gone orange with rust, and something in her face came undone for just a second. Lord, she said quietly, it still smells like him. I know it, said Eleanor, pipe and cedar and river and river. Dot put her hand flat against the wall the way a person touches the shoulder of someone they have missed. And then she took the hand back and was the harbor master again, brisk and dry. All right. If Walt hid something on this boat, he didn't hide it where the damp would get it, and he didn't hide it where a thief would think to look first, because Walt thought about thieves the way other men think about weather, constant. Start with the galley. He kept everything in that galley but groceries. So they searched. Eleanor went through the little galley drawers one at a time, and they were full of exactly what an old man's drawers are full of: twine and fish hooks, and a church key, and a deck of cards so soft with handling the faces had near worn off, and 3 different flashlights and not one working battery among them. She emptied each drawer onto the bunk and ran her hand around the inside of it and found nothing, and she was reaching to slide the last one back into its slot when her fingers, going where her eyes couldn't, found a small, hard shape taped up under the bottom of it. She went still. Dot. What? There's something taped under here. She worked it loose with her thumbnail, the tape old and gone brittle and giving up without much fight, and a thing dropped into her palm with a small, cold weight. A key. Brass, dark with handling, old as the boat, and tied to it with a bit of fishing line, a paper tag, and on the tag in pencil gone silver with age, in that same square shaking hand from the beam over the wheel, 4 words. Stern, Eleanor read out. Not the engine. The cabin went quiet enough to hear the water move against the hull. Dot Pruitt came over and took the key out of Eleanor's hand and held it up to the gray light from the hatch and looked at it a long, long while. And when she spoke, her voice had changed. I'll be damned, she said softly. I'll be good and damned. He did have a key. You knew about it? I knew he was particular about one. Years back, the county come through making everybody label their fuel shutoffs and their engine boxes, fire rules, and Walt got cagey as a cat about a key he carried, and when the inspector asked him what it went to, Walt told him the engine box, and the inspector wrote it down and went on his way. Dot turned the brass key over in her fingers. Engine box. Everybody out here that ever wondered just figured Walt kept his engine locked because Walt locked everything. And here all along, the man's own tag says it plain, not the engine. She looked at Eleanor. It's the stern, honey. It was always the stern. That dog of yours has been telling you so since you walked up the dock, and you've been calling him spiders. Biscuit, hearing himself discussed, thumped his tail twice against the wet board and did not get up off it. And that is the moment, of course, that they heard the boots on the dock. A young man, not much past 30 by the smooth of his face, in pressed khakis and a navy polo shirt with a small white logo stitched over the heart, was coming down the finger of dock toward the Marigold slip with a clipboard in one hand and a stapler in the other, and the careful, sorry, hurry-up walk of a person who's been sent to do a thing he would rather not have to stand still for. Eleanor came up the ladder into the daylight, and Dot came grunting up behind her, and the young man stopped a respectful 10 feet off and cleared his throat. "Ma'am, are you, He checked the clipboard. "I'm looking for the owner of record, or I'm to post if there's nobody." "You found her," Eleanor said. "Eleanor Hargrove. I own the Marigold." The logo over his heart, now that she was up close to it in the sun, said Callaway Development Group in clean white letters, and below it, smaller, Riverfront Reimagined. The young man's ears went pink. "Mrs. Hargrove, this is. I'm just delivering this. I want to be clear, it's not. I don't make these decisions." He peeled a sheet of paper off the top of his clipboard and held it out. And when she didn't take it right away, he set it on the piling and stapled it there. 3 quick shots, and the sound of the stapler going off in the morning quiet made Biscuit bark once from down below. "There's a notice on the slip, too. I'm sorry. You have a good morning." And he went back up the dock faster than he had come down it. Eleanor read the notice taped to her own piling with the river going by behind it. It was a clean and bloodless thing, all capital letters and statute numbers. And what it said, underneath the numbers, was that the vessel occupying Slip 11, a houseboat known as the Marigold, registration long lapsed, had been determined to be an abandoned vessel under the terms of the marina's pending sale, and that the said marina and the upland parcel and the water lot beneath it were the subject of a demolition and redevelopment permit, signed, dated, approved, and that all vessels were to be removed or would be removed at the owner's cost. And a date was given, and the date was 3 weeks out. And at the bottom, where a person signs a thing they are proud of, was the name Brett Callaway. And beside it, the small, clean logo, the same one she had read off a young man's chest, the same one that had been stitched, she had no doubt, onto the jacket of the man on the 8th floor, who had buttoned himself up rather than watch her go down 14 stairs for the last time. She stood there in the mustard cardigan with the river smell all around her and read the word abandoned twice. "Abandoned," she said. "That's the word they use," Dot said, "for anything they want and don't yet have. They called my marina abandoned with me, still standing in the office. It's not a description, honey. It's a wish," wrote down official, "so it'll come true." Eleanor folded the notice off the piling, slow and careful, and folded it again and put it in the pocket of her cardigan with her grandfather's 6 carved words, sitting somewhere behind her breastbone where she could feel the cold of them. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks. "Then I expect," said Eleanor Hargrove, "we'd better go open the stern. You have likely already guessed what was waiting under that board. I promise you have not." They went back down into the cabin, and Eleanor got down on her knees on the wet floor beside Biscuit, and the old dog finally moved aside, satisfied at last that the slow human had understood, and he sat and watched her with his whole heart in his face. The board he had worn pale was a single plank in a run of planks, no different to the eye, except that when Eleanor pressed at one end of it, the other end lifted just a hair on a hidden pivot, the way a thing lifts that was built to lift by a man who didn't want it looking like it could. She got her fingers under the risen end. She pulled. It came up with a soft, sucking breath of cold air that smelled of nothing at all. Not bilge, not river, not damp, just cold, dry, dark. And that absence of smell was the strangest thing she had met yet on that boat, because everything else aboard the Marigold smelled of the water it floated on. Below the board was not bilge. Below the board was a hatch, a small square hatch, low in the stern, set into a bulkhead that had been built and sealed and built again, the seams packed with a black gasketing gone hard as iron, the whole of it sitting lower than the water line outside the hull, so that the brown river was pressing on the far side of it right now, this minute, and not one drop coming through. And set into the middle of the hatch, green with the years but unmistakable, was a small brass lock. Eleanor's hands were not entirely steady when she fit the key to it. "He built this," Dot said behind her, very quiet, leaning as far down the ladder as her knees would let her. "He built a dry room under the river. That old fox, that old fox." The key turned hard, and then it turned. The lock gave with a sound like a knuckle cracking, and the little hatch swung in on a void of dark, and Eleanor reached one of the dead flashlights at it before she remembered it was dead, and Dot, without a word, handed down her own from a loop on her belt, harbor master to the last, and in its yellow cone, Eleanor saw the strongbox. It was a green metal box about the size of a bread loaf, the kind sold in hardware stores for 50 years, and it sat up on 2 cedar blocks to keep it off the floor of the void, and a square of oilcloth had been folded over the top of it and tucked down the sides, the careful way you tuck a child in. Eleanor lifted it out with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. She backed up on her knees and set it on the wet floor in the gray light and folded back the oilcloth. And the box underneath was not locked at all because the man had spent his locks on the hatch and the river and trusted whoever got that far. She opened the lid. On the top lay bonds, United States savings bonds, the old paper kind with the eagle and the careful engraving, banded in tens with rubber bands gone to powder that broke when she touched them, and every one of them stamped with a date long enough ago that the smallest child on those bonds was now a grown and matured sum, bought a little at a time, the first of the month for 20 years, by a man who paid his slip fee in cash from an envelope and let the whole river think he was broke. Eleanor did not count them. She could not have made her eyes hold still long enough to count them. But she saw enough dates and enough denominations fanned under the flashlight to know that her grandfather, Walt Hargrove, had not died broke at all. He had died richer than anyone who ever pitied him. And he had done it underwater, on purpose, where no bank could fail and no creditor could reach, and no court could sign it away with a clean, cold word like abandoned. The river keeps what the bank can't. And underneath the bonds was a ledger. It was a school composition book, the marbled black and white kind Eleanor herself had handed out by the case in 26 years of feeding school children, swelled fat with damp it had never quite gotten and dried again, and she lifted it out with 2 hands and opened it, and it was full, page after page, of that same square shaking hand, dates down the left and small sums beside them, the patient arithmetic of a careful man. And she turned the pages toward the end with her thumb going faster than her breath, and on the last page that had any writing on it at all, the hand was bigger and shakier than anywhere else, written late, written hard, written by a man who knew his hands were running out of days, and it was not arithmetic. It was her name. For Eleanor, it said. For Eleanor. When she has nowhere left to go, the Marigold is yours. The slip is yours. The river kept it safe. Eleanor Hargrove knelt on the wet floor of a boat she had owned for 4 years and never once driven out to sea. A boat she had thought of, when she thought of it at all, as the last thing a woman in an apartment needed. And she read her own name in her dead grandfather's hand, and the cardigan and the river and the gray light all went to water in front of her. And she put one hand over her mouth and made no sound at all, And Biscuit, who had been telling her about this since the moment her foot first touched the dock, leaned the whole graying weight of himself against her side and held her up the only way a dog knows how. For Eleanor, when she has nowhere left to go, he had known. 40 years he had loved her from a distance she had let grow. A Christmas card and a phone call that ran out of words. And somewhere in all that quiet, he had looked down the length of his own life and out across the length of hers. And he had built her a dry room under a brown river and put her name in it. Against a day he would not live to see, the day the world told her she had nowhere left to go. And the world had told her exactly that on the 8th floor, with a man buttoning his jacket. And here she was, exactly where he had left the light on for her. It was a long while before she could speak, and when she did, her voice came out rough and small. "Dot," she said, "there's a paper down here under the ledger. Fold it, it's got a seal on it." She lifted it out. It was heavy cream stock gone soft at the folds, sealed once in wax and protected in its own square of oilcloth like the box itself. And through the top fold where it had worn thin, she could make out the heavy printed words of a thing that was not a bond and was not a ledger, a thing with a county's name across the top of it and the words deed and trust and recorded in letters meant to last, and a date on it that was older than Eleanor was. Dot Pruitt, leaning down off that ladder with her bad knees screaming, went very still when she saw the cream paper, and the look that crossed her weathered face was the same quick-turning thing Eleanor had seen at the mention of the Hargrove name, only slower now and surer, like a fish that has finally decided to come all the way up to the surface. "Don't you open that here, honey," she said quietly. "Don't you get River on that. Not that one." She wet her lips. "You hold that one careful, and you let me make a phone call or two. Because if that paper is what these old eyes think it is, then Mr. Brett Calloway has signed his name to a permit to tear down a thing that does not belong to him, and never did. And there is a room in this county built exactly for the showing of papers like that one." She looked at the green box, and the bonds, and the open ledger with Eleanor's name lying face up in the flashlight, and the corner of her mouth pulled. "Walt, you old fox." You waited. Eleanor sat back on her heels with the deed held careful and dry against the front of her cardigan, over the folded notice with the word abandoned in it. Over her own heart, and through the little galley window the morning sun came in off the slow brown stretch of the Tennessee River and laid a line of gold across the cabin floor, across the open hatch, across the dog, and she did not yet know the half of what that cream paper would prove, did not yet know whose name had been carved into the very boat she sat in or why, but she knew this much, holding it. She had come to the river with $43 and a duffel bag and an old dog and nowhere left to go, and the river had been keeping something for her the whole time. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and got slowly to her feet. "All right, Walt," she said, "to the boat, to the beam over the wheel, to the cold, dry room under the water. All right. Make your calls, Dot. I believe I'd like to see that room." Dot Pruitt made her telephone calls from the end of the dock with one hand cupped over the receiver against the wind, coming off Fort Loudoun Lake, and Eleanor caught only pieces of them. A name, a county office. The word recorded said twice and slow, and every time Dot said that word her back came up straighter, until the old harbor master stood there on her ruined knees, like a woman half her age, who had just recalled exactly where a thing was buried. It took the better part of those 3 weeks. Dot drove out to her little brick house off North Shore Drive and came back with a milk crate, and then a second one, and set them down on the galley table, and they were full of the paper the Marina office had thrown out across 40 years, paper Dot Pruitt had carried home instead of letting them burn it, slip ledgers and green cloth covers, carbon receipts on flimsy pink sheets, a fee book for every season going back further than Eleanor cared to count. "They called me a pack rat," Dot said, wetting her thumb and turning leaves. "Said it like it was a sin. Sit down, honey. You're fixing to learn what a pack rat is good for." She found slip 11 in the oldest book first, and then in every book after it, and she turned the receipts toward Eleanor under the galley light. The hand that signed each one collected belonged to some marina clerk, but the name that paid, year on year, season on season, was the same square shaking hand Eleanor now knew better than her own father's. Walt Hargrove, paying his slip fee in cash from an envelope, the whole river thinking him a broke old man too stubborn to move along. He paid rent, Eleanor said slowly, all those years. He paid something, Dot said, and her eyes had gone bright and hard. Whether it was rent is a question for that cream paper you're keeping dry, because a man doesn't generally pay rent on water he already owns, unless he's a careful man and he wants a record 40 years long that says he was here, every single season, out in the open, paying, never gone, never once absent. You might suppose the strongbox under the floor was the whole of what Walt Hargrove had hidden. The boat had been carrying a larger secret for 40 years, painted plain across its own stern, where every soul on that dock could read it, and not one of them, Eleanor least of all, had ever once thought to ask what it meant. They took the cream paper to a lawyer Dot knew from her church, a quiet woman with an office above a coffee place near downtown Knoxville, and she laid it flat on a clean table under a good lamp and read it through twice before she said anything at all. Then she set one finger on a line near the top. "This is a deed of conveyance," she said, "recorded with Knox County. The water lot at slip 11, the slip itself and a strip of the upland bank, sold and recorded into the name of a trust." She moved her finger down. "The Marigold Trust, settled by Walter Hargrove. Named, I'd guess, for the beneficiary right here." And she turned the page so Eleanor could read it, and the name on the line was Marigold Hargrove, and beneath it, in lawyer's language gone soft with age, the words for his beloved wife. Eleanor sat very still. She had never once known her grandmother's name. The woman had died young, long before Eleanor was even a thought, and Walt had never spoken of her in 40 years of Christmas cards. And the family had let the silence stand the way families do, and all that while the name had been riding the brown water of the Tennessee River in foot-high letters on the back of a boat, where Walt could see it from the wheel every morning of his life. Marigold. He had bought the very ground the marina stood on, a piece of it, and recorded it, and wrapped it in his wife's name, so that no bank and no buyer and no clean, cold permit could ever pry it loose. And then he had floated her name on top of it for 40 years and let the world go on calling him broke. Then the marina, Eleanor said. The marina sold Mr. Calloway a great many things, the lawyer said. It does not appear that slip 11, or the water beneath it, was ever theirs to sell. The hearing was in the city-county building on Main Street, in a room with tired carpet and a long table, and a row of commissioners who had a permit in front of them they had already half approved. Brett Calloway sat at the front in a jacket the same clean navy as the notice that had been nailed to her piling, and when his name was called, he rose and fastened the middle button with the easy hand of a man who had never once had to stand in a hallway while a door was locked behind him. He spoke well. He spoke of progress, of a riverfront reimagined, of a tired old marina, and the vessels left to rot at its slips. And when he said that last part, Eleanor felt Dot go still beside her. When it came Eleanor's turn, she did not make a speech. She had fed school children in Knoxville for 26 years, and she knew that the loudest thing in any room is the thing set down quietly in front of people. She walked to the table in her mustard cardigan, and she set down the marbled composition book with her grandfather's patient arithmetic in it, and beside it she laid the cream deed, recorded, sealed, 40 years old. Then Dot Pruitt came up behind her on those bad knees and laid down the receipts, season after season, slip 11, paid, present, accounted for, the whole long, honest paper trail of a careful man. and she squared the stack with one weathered finger and stepped back. The room got quiet. The county's own lawyer leaned over the deed, then murmured something to the chair, and the chair murmured to the woman beside him. And a recess was called that every soul in the room understood was not a recess. Brett Calloway did not fasten his jacket a second time. He sat with the small, fixed smile of a man watching a number he had counted on slide off the board, because you cannot clear ground to raise a tower when one corner of that ground has belonged for 40 recorded years to a dead man's wife, and now to his granddaughter. It did not all finish that afternoon, the way these things never do, but the clerk at the Knox County Register of Deeds pulled the original from the bound book where it had lain untouched since before Eleanor was grown, and it was real, and it was recorded. And within the month, the probate court moved the slip and the parcel and the strip of bank out of a 40-year-old trust and into the name Eleanor Hargrove. And Brett Calloway's demolition permit was stayed, held, frozen where it sat while the title it had stepped over got sorted out. And down at Concord Marina, the placards came off the pilings, not only hers, the whole row of them, because a permit cannot tear down one dock and leave a single corner standing. And so a man who had lived 4 slips down on an old pontoon boat for 19 years, a man who had already packed his kitchen into boxes and taped the lids, carried his coffee pot back aboard and plugged it into the wall. The notice that had called the Marigold abandoned went into a drawer in Dot's brick house, in with all the other papers she could never quite bring herself to throw away. Eleanor stayed. She baled the bilge until it ran clean, and she scrubbed the galley down to its grain, and she hung waltz quilts out in the sun off North Shore Drive until they smelled of nothing but warm cotton. And on an evening in early summer, she carried a cup of coffee out onto the stern while the light went down over Fort Loudon Lake and turned the slow water to copper and then to slate. Biscuit lay stretched along the warm boards beside her, gray in the muzzle, easy at last, asleep before the first star came out. Behind her, through the little galley window, the lamp she had left burning laid a long yellow stripe across the darkening river. The Marigold glowed warm from the inside, the only lit window on the whole marina. On the stern, Biscuit slept, and Eleanor watched the river go black.